had the civil rights being fought in the South with Martin Luther King. We had the whole hippie movement start up. Actually, the second wave of the feminist movement started then. There was an earlier wave for the right to vote. That goes way back before my time. Later on, there was the 70s, and the feminist movement got its feet under it. And it really hasn't stopped since then. And the civil rights movement has made, since my time, leaps and bounds. A friend of mine that was in the service in the South, Georgia, I think it was, could have been Alabama, and that was in the 60s. There was 3 sergeants. There was him, another white sergeant, and a black sergeant. And they worked together in Army intelligence. And he was from Portland, so he didn't know anything about the South that much. He was down there, but he did notice they had drinking fountains that said white only, and they had, which he thought was odd, because that wasn't up here at that time. And not that we didn't have a history in Portland, but he went to, they were going to a movie. And they were, like I said, they were good friends. So they were going to this movie, and they went into the theater, and all of a sudden the black guy starts going up, the black sergeant starts going up to the balcony. And they go, hey, wait, no, we're not going to sit up there, let's sit down here. He goes, that's right, I'll see you after the movie. And they go, no, come on down here. You don't have to wait to see us after the movie. And he goes, no, you don't get it. They go, okay, we'll come up with you. And he goes, no, you can't. Go downstairs, I'll see you after the movie. Well, he was from the South. And back then, it was white only on the main floor and black only on the balcony. So mind open, it just surprised him that was. It wasn't like there was a lot of violence or anything going on. It was just, this is the way the society had segregated itself. Anyway, that was the era where that started changing. And then you had this Vietnam War that had been going on for a little while, all the way, mostly through the 60s, and it probably ended, I think, at 71, 72, I think. And anyway, it was an interesting time. A lot of things changed then. You had Timothy Leary, Ken Kesey. I don't know, did you ever read anything on those guys? Okay. Ken Kesey wrote 2 books. Well, he might have wrote 3 books, but he wrote 2 famous books. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and it was changed to Never Give an Inch for the movie, but it was, that might have been it. It might have been the name of the book. No, it wasn't. Anyway, famous books. He was from Oregon. He's from Eugene, Oregon. And he took the Merry Pranksters around. And the Merry Pranksters were all on a bus. The bus was called Further. It was an old school bus. It was refurbished. And have you ever heard of the band Grateful Dead? Okay, Grateful Dead started with that group. They were on the bus. They were learning musicians. They weren't the top of the notch, but that was where light shows started. But they got everything now, but they started light shows. And Ken Kesey was one of the fellows that tested LSD for the government at the colleges. They would have students test it. They wanted to know what it was doing. The government paid for these tests. And Timothy Leary was. And Timothy Leary, I don't know, he was a professor down at UCLA or Berkeley. It was down in California, probably Berkeley. And Timothy Leary, as a professor, started to teach. He would say, drop out, tune in, drop out, and something else. Anyway, it was take LSD and just get out of school and the whole thing. And he thought it was LSD was going to be a complete changer for society in America. It did do a lot of changes, but it wasn't what he thought. Ken Kesey used to think the same thing. And with American Pranksters, as a matter of fact, up here it happened in Portland. They would come in to like park blocks and set up this band, set up the light show, and before they got there, they would be sending out flyers. And the kids in the colleges knew, but it would be, can you pass the acid test? They wrote a book about this. It was Wolf wrote this book, The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. That's what they called it, Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. And people would come down to the parks blocks, and they would have 2 GI cans with Kool-Aid in them. And one of the Kool-Aid said, for the little boys, another one said, this for the big boys. Different doses of LSD. People didn't know what LSD was back then. And some people didn't know what that was and would take it. You know? I mean, it was like, what the heck? We're just listening to the band. It was like an event. Anyway, a lot of people back then got into a movement in the 60s. The thing to remember about that era is we were all part of the generation right after World War II. We were the kids in World War II, the baby boom. There was a lot of kids born then. There were so many bands, great bands back then because those kids all came of age. And a lot of them wanted to be in a band. So a lot of great bands started up from that period. After World War II, people felt confident enough to have kids. And the World War II generation, the war was over. The ones that survived were back home. There was GI loans. You could build a house. They were helping servicemen build houses. And so for families, and because the job market was so good, single working parent, like father worked, mother stayed home to raise the kids and take care of the household. It's common. And you're not going to see much of that anymore. That changed. Some people think that was a good aspect about that era. I don't know. I really don't. Now it takes two people working to try to make ends meet. It's not the way it used to be. It used to be financially, you can do it off one income. Anyway, so those kids were growing up and they wanted to be different from their parents. When I was in school, if I went to school with I had a shirt that had tails, they had to dress up for school. If the tails were out, and they were actually tails that wasn't cut straight, they'd say to tuck it in or leave. And if you had pants with the belt loops, you better have a belt then. Don't have a belt, go home. If you don't have the belt loops because it's that type of pants, that was okay. Everybody had to have a certain cut haircut, not the way mine is now. But crew cuts were the most common haircut for men, for boys. All barbers know how to do a crew cut. Sit down, maybe you get a flat top, but parents just thought this was the easiest way. So you see a lot of old pictures and a lot of kids had crew cuts. And I can remember being kicked out of school for growing my hair out. This was before the Beatles. Okay? The Beatles hadn't got it. When the Beatles came, everybody started growing their hair out. But we used to watch old Johnny Weissmuller movies. I don't know if you ever remember the old Tarzan movies with Johnny Weissmuller, but he was a swimmer. He was an Olympic swimmer, and he had longer hair. And it was usually crazy because he was in the jungles, fighting crocodiles and whatever. Anyways, as young people, we thought that was okay. And we'd grow our hair out, and it kind of really wasn't a problem until the Beatles came out. I mean, it was different. People but it wasn't a big fuss made. When the Beatles came out and other kids started growing their hair, they said, that's it. Get your hair cut. It's got to be this short. Don't come back to school. I got told that. I got into a big row with my parents about it. It was either that or no education. Girls wore dresses. They wore pants to school. Dresses had to be down to at least the top of the knees. All of that's changed after our general, and there was discipline in the class. If they had a problem with discipline, they just got sent home, either suspended or expelled. And I mean, they didn't mess with that. Was the way our fathers taught. Now we rebelled against that, but there's some things to remember about that. When we wanted to rebel, you do something simple. Maybe you grow your hair out. Maybe you don't wear a belt to school. Nowadays, you want to rebel, what do? Take heroin? What is it you do to show that you're different? So they set up rules to where the ones that you broke, but they weren't going to kill you. They weren't. Back then, you used to be able to hitchhike anywhere you want to go. I hitchhiked from California up to Oregon probably 10, maybe 11 different times. And not that all that was not real easy. Sometimes it took a couple of days to make the trip. But and not that it was safe. It's only you didn't have 24-hour news cycles and you weren't hearing about stuff all the time. Probably wasn't safe. There was probably people that, I'm sure there were people that turned up missing back then, the same as they do now. But it was, I mean, we did it when we were kids. I can remember doing it at 11 years old. Hitchhiking. So these are probably some things that you can see that have changed. During that time, part of the rebellion was Vietnam War started. This was after the Korean War. You had World War II, you had Korea conflict, and then the Vietnam War started. The Vietnam War originally started with, after World War II, things were kind of broken up, split up. You can see it how it was done in the Middle East. Some of the stuff didn't make any sense. But after World War II, it was communism. And the communists were, Germany was out of the picture, so all that was left were the communists and the democracies. And so Europe, what was left of Europe, the Iron Curtain came down between Russia, all through the Baltic states, split Germany right in half. Berlin had the Berlin Wall, and it was all split up. This part was Soviet, and then where the Chinese were, that was all communist through parts of Asia. And the idea back then, the policies that they put in, which I understood, that the people in those days believed that capitalism was the most effective way to run an economy. It wasn't perfect, but it was the most effective. And so the whole idea is that they were looking at how the Russians and the Chinese were moving and what they were doing in their own countries, and they thought, well, if we can contain them, just contain them where they're at, our system will prove the better system, and they'll collapse. And that was believed. Now, nobody wanted to believe this. Our generation would say, oh, that's the domino theory. In other words, if one country goes, and another country goes, and another country goes. Because communism had to expand. That was their whole philosophy. Because they didn't do well on their own. Look at Venezuela. No country like that works well. It always turns into the same thing. Unless you back out of it quick enough like they did in Sweden and Norway, start backing out of it. It always winds up not being very effective. Like I said, capitalism might have its problems. So the idea was contain them. We had to contain the Soviet Union where it was at after Roosevelt gave them all of Eastern Europe. And we had to contain the Chinese. And both of them were interested in Southeast Asia. Both the Russians and the Chinese were interested in it. And Ho Chi Minh was the leader of the North Vietnamese, and he played the Russians off against the Chinese and tried to play the United States, but he was going to go communist. And that was against our idea of containment. That's what happened in Korea. We stopped them at the parallel, and that was it. That's all the further you can go this way. And Vietnam was the same thing. Wanted to stop there because they had Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand all sitting down there. So that was the philosophy of why they went into Vietnam. Kennedy sent advisors in there. I met some guys that were in special forces in those days when it was brand new that were over in Vietnam. That was back in the early 60s. And then Lyndon Johnson became president and had the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where a ship got attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin. They used that as an excuse to invade Vietnam, or send a bunch of troops into Vietnam. They didn't run into any obstacles. They were in there to support the South Vietnamese government. And there was a mistake in how they ran the war. There was a guy named McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense under Lyndon Johnson. McNamara went to Harvard. And as many good things you can say about Harvard as as many bad things you can say about Harvard. One thing that Harvard teaches is a lot of theory, but it doesn't teach practicality. So, and theory is fine in a lot of scholastic subjects, but when you try to apply it, it doesn't always work out. Right now from Harvard, we've got identity politics starting up. It's two French guys that came to Harvard, but still, and started America out of Harvard. That's fine theory, but it's balkanizing America. We never used to be quite that way. You know, we were a long time ago. Now we're going to go back, I guess, where the pit the races against each other. Anyway, it's McNamara had an idea how the war should be fought, and so, and it had a lot to do with body counts and like showing a winning and losing, like you're running almost a corporation that you're that this is happening, and they never came in to grab territory and hold like they did in World War II. Didn't feel they needed to do that. They just needed to keep drawing the enemy out and trying to annihilate them wherever they could draw them out into. Well, in Vietnam you had Viet Cong, which were locals in the South that were fighting on the side of the North. And you had the North Vietnamese Army regulars, which were different. They were regular armed troops. Just like any other army, they were well trained, well supplied, completely different, two types of foes. And on the United States side, you know, you had Navy, Air Force, Marines, Army, and you had, but it wasn't going to be fought like a conventional war. It was mostly jungle fighting and fighting in among an indigenous population. In other words, that guy that's out there working in the paddies today in a regular farm outfit, tonight's going to put on black pajamas and try to kill me. That's how they did it. And in any other war, that would be either partisan or that would be like you're not wearing a uniform. And in any other war, that's how you get executed, because that's part of the Geneva Convention. You got to wear a uniform. If you're going to fight, put on a uniform. You're not going to do that, then no government supports you. Nobody can cry for your loss. Anyway, that was but McNamara pursued this in a way that, to give you an example of how much we learned since then. So McNamara, when George Bush Sr. started in Desert Storm, when Kuwait was attacked by Iraq with Saddam Hussein, George W. Bush was worried because it looked like he was going to move his troops right into Saudi Arabia. But he captured the oil fields of Kuwait and wanted Saudi Arabia. So he said, we're going to set up a defensive structure here called Desert Shield. Told the press that. It's just enough to just stop them and going after
Mm-hmm.
Saudi Arabia. And that became Desert Storm. The media was furious. You didn't tell us. No, you didn't. Because you'll tell the enemy. See, in World War II, the media never did that.
Mm-hmm.
They never told the enemy what we're doing. Loose lips, sink ships. The media didn't have any problem with being censored.
Yeah.
Because they knew that's how things go terribly bad for soldiers, because that's just an intelligence source. George Bush Sr. had fought in World War II. He was a Navy pilot. I don't know if you know the story. He got shot down, was rescued out at sea by a submarine. Anyway, George Bush said, wanted his people, they set up a group. They were kiddingly called the Jedi Knights. But they were a group of defense people that were scholarly, and they were looking at Vietnam, and they were looking at all the mistakes that were made in Vietnam that they could relate back to a book called Sun Tzu's Art of War.
Mm-hmm.
If you've never read it, it's a good book to read. There's corporations that read this book, besides countries. Sun Tzu's Art of War, Sun Tzu was a military genius who fought in the old days of China when there were just different kingdoms all through China. He hadn't united yet. Mm-hmm. And he came out with a philosophy on how war should be fought. First off, he was against fighting wars. But he said, if that can't be done, and you have to do this, then these are the things that you need to do. Mm-hmm. And then he talked about the best and the worst. And it's almost as though when they got done, that everything that was done in Vietnam was in a directly refuting what Sun Tzu said. And we paid a price for every one. You could go back and say, gee, it should have been done this way. It should have been done. Sun Tzu, because it was almost like he was seeing, these are all the things you go through. Yeah. And so, George Bush says, I want a plan based on that book. Well, just a little example is that with the king, you call him the king or the prince, you're going to release the dogs of war, okay? You've decided that there's no way out, you've got to go into war. So now, you tell your generals, go out and fetch me up the whatever. Mm-hmm. But, my job's done, and it is. Unless there's any diplomacy to be done, his job's done, except for the diplomacy, he doesn't tell the generals how to do the war. Yeah. That's not his business. Mm-hmm. That's their business. His job is to try to be as deceitful as he can to fool the enemy as well. They were mad at George Bush for telling the press that it was just Desert Shield. He was following Sun Tzu's Art of War. No, you don't get to know because I want to fool him. So I'm going to tell you this so that you'll tell him. Mm-hmm. And he did that continually. And everybody kept getting mad at him because he kept fooling. He brought his whole troops down to the south end of Iraq by having the Marines out there on ships with hovercraft. And he had let the press, they got to go on and watch and see him on the ships and everything. That was enough to move all the troops down. They never intended on putting those troops there. Mm-hmm. Put all of his mines, all those troops, and got cut right into it. It was a beautiful strategy. The most Americans who got killed in the Desert Storm were killed by friendly fire, mm-hmm. not by the enemy. It was a pure Sun Tzu script. Mm-hmm. Jedi Knights came up with this. Anyway, McNamara did everything the wrong way. He apologized later. He felt that he shouldn't have done it. Pursued that war with that kind of goals in mind, mm-hmm. because they were so. Anyway, it's another thing over there. Anyway, a lot of things changed during the 60s.
So what was your initial opinion about the Vietnam War?
Well, I don't know. I volunteered. Mm-hmm. I understood the idea of containing. When we grew up, we knew what the threat of communism was. Mm-hmm. Schools weren't allowed to teach that socialism was a great thing. Yeah. Teachers did feel that way, but it wasn't taught. Mm-hmm. So we saw it, even though I'm sure a lot of guys feel they were betrayed, Because when they would take something, like take a hill, beat the enemy off the hill, they didn't stay there. They didn't get to stay there and say, okay, we own this property, now we own that property, now we tie it up and just drive them. No, back off and let them have it again. Now go take it again. The strategy was just insane. There was like I say, it wasn't. But the philosophy behind it proved to be correct. Or in South Vietnam, here's something that they tried to teach my kids. I had to correct a teacher at my kid's school because they said Vietnam War was Richard Nixon's war. My daughter came up to me and says, "What are you talking about?" She said, "Well, that's what the teachers told me." I said, "Well, that's not true. Richard Nixon ended the war. Lyndon Johnson started the war. He built up all the troops." If you want to say somebody's war, say Lyndon Johnson, or you could say Kennedy. He's one of the first put troops in there. They didn't like the way Nixon pursued it. That was when all the protests, my generation, started going. I was in the service, so I didn't go in with protesters. But when they were protesting, it was Nixon happened to be the one that took over after Johnson. Johnson couldn't run for re-election. He knew he'd lose, so he said, I'm not going to, because of the war.
Yeah.
But Johnson did a lot of things. People think that Johnson, they forget, they think Kennedy signed the Civil Rights Act. Yeah, it wasn't Kennedy, it was Johnson. As a matter of fact, Kennedy couldn't have done it, but Johnson could have, because he knew where all the skeletons were in people's closets, and he's the one that cut that pass. But Johnson wound up doing just the opposite in Vietnam. He would decide where the bombing was going to go. I mean, he would be like in on the plans, and he wasn't a military man. And that's a mistake. That's just, he was looking at it politically. It was always with a political calculation.
Yeah.
And you can't mix those two things. It's a terrible thing when you have to have a war, but you have to get rid of the politics. Except where it's necessary. You just gotta, because you're now, everything's broken down. The diplomacy obviously is broken down. That's why you're in a war. So you have to let the generals take care of the war, and they come in with the diplomacy afterwards. A lot of people think that we were kicked out of Vietnam. If you look at a proper book, you'll find that what happened, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. Our troops left Vietnam. It was in the 70s, 71, I think. All our troops left. And what was there was the South Vietnamese army fighting the North Vietnamese army. And we still had some advisors there. We had embassy personnel, like we do in a lot of countries. And they always show pictures of people getting taken by helicopter off our embassy. And the troops are there because they have to bring in the helicopters to get the people out of the embassy. And they think we say that's where we were defeated. Well, no, that's not what happened. We never lost a major battle in Vietnam, ever, none. Battle of Hue was a defeat for the North Vietnamese. So was the Khe Sanh. They thought they would drive the Marines out and have this great battle that they would win in Khe Sanh. Didn't happen. Matter of fact, Westmoreland drew them in so he could use his bombers on them. And Nixon mined the harbors of Haiphong up in North Vietnam to keep our allies, because a lot of them were allies, from shipping any stuff up there, saying, hey, I'm not going to blow up your ship. Try not to hit any of those mine zones. That was enough. No insurance companies would cover them. So they don't know, you don't take your ships up there. We're not going to pay for your ship if it gets blown up there. So that, and with the bombing campaign, and he used to play with his, what's his name? Not McNamara, of course, he was gone. It was a famous diplomat, his State Department head. Name just escapes me right now. Anyway, they'd play good guy, bad guy, good cop, bad cop. And he would be negotiating and say, hey, look at, he's crazy, he just bombs you, I can't stop him. You got to negotiate something. And they did. They negotiated fresh peace accords. They would not attack Vietnam. They could have North Vietnam. They're not going to attack Vietnam. We'll get out. They're not to attack Vietnam. So that was the deal. That was the deal. You don't attack, we leave. So we leave. So they're up there. Nothing's going on for quite a while. But then it came to a vote in Congress on whether or not fund this venture where we would keep paying to help supply, take care of the South Vietnamese troops, make sure they had what they needed. And Congress voted it down. And they did it just to spite the president. And when they did, I don't remember, right, it was like 9 or 10 divisions of the North Vietnamese army just ran across the border, broke the peace accords, said the heck with the peace accords. That's what happened. And so they just blitzkrieg on into the South. The South Vietnamese army knew we weren't going to help them at all. That army just collapsed. And Cambodia went with Pol Pot. Laos, they couldn't get into Thailand. They got into Laos, couldn't get into Thailand. All that's changed now. Pol Pot killed millions. Vietnamese, South Vietnamese used to get on boats, on boat people, try to come over to America. They get on boats to do it. Nobody wanted to hear about it because it was supposed to be paradise now. Communists took over. Now the communists were re-educating them right into the grave. And Cambodia, like I said, killed millions. They would shoot people. If they caught a guy like you wearing glasses, they would automatically shoot you. You might be a school teacher. Or you might be scholarly. That was enough. These guys didn't care. Nope, we're all going to be farmers now. We don't need you. We don't need you. And that was another socialist utopia. Anyway, so the guy that predicted that happening was correct. Those did collapse. But the one thing that did happen with that was that they overextended. And they couldn't... China had its Great Leap Forward. They were trying to make their people, they were going to sell steel. They had a lot of great plans. Biggest famine in the history of humanity on this planet was then. You can look that up. Great Leap Forward. I can't remember how many millions, many millions of people just starved to death. Communists didn't care. Mao Zedong didn't care. You die, good, let's eat. You know, that was the idea. I don't know why that wasn't given more. I don't know that it's even taught anymore. But you can't. You look up famines. That when you go through the famine list, you'll come to the worst, progressive order, and that was the worst for humanity. Anyway, Russia was trying to compete with the United States, and it had missiles, it had nukes, so we had mutually assured destruction. In other words, nobody wanted to start it because it was assuring that both sides get wiped out. So what's the point? There's no win in there. What's the point? But there was still always the fear that something did start it. So we used to practice in school. We would have a set of fire drills. We'd have these air raid drills where everybody got under the desk. Huddled up, got under the desk like that's going to save you from a nuclear explosion. And even back then we were thinking, don't know, this isn't the same as... Anyway, that used to be the deal. I had that... Growing up, I think a lot of my generation was rebellious in a way was because of that. We grew up under that kind of cloud, the idea that this world we could destroy ourselves because they just went through World War II. If you want to look at a good, take you about 15 minutes, maybe less, short on YouTube, look up The Dead of World War II, and it's animated. I want to look for the one that's animated. And it's an eye-opener as to how many people died in that war, and how many were civilians compared to how many were soldiers, how many old, young, and they go through it and they give you these little graphs. They're constantly showing you how many people died. As a matter of fact, right now, we're in what they call the Great Peace. are the long piece. Because we've only had little tiny wars. Yeah. We've had no major conflicts like the world wars. This is a very good thing. Unless you just want to decimate populations, there's no reason to have those kind of wars. And that's the way that period of, and the threat back then was communists. They used to say, we'll bury you. Schuster, famous line, he will bury you. In a speech he made. And so, in that period, I think a lot of the young people that grew up in my generation thought that they were going to change the world. Because there were so many of us, one thing compared to the goal. And we were going to make it a better place. Don't fall into that trap. You always do want to try to do the best you can. Yeah. It's not necessarily going to be better. You know, I mean, things change. Here's an example. Okay, I used to vacillate on the notion of abortion. That started when I was young, and part of the feminist movement started. Part of the reason for that was birth control. A lot of people, a lot of my friends, a lot of people in that day got married because their girlfriend got pregnant. That's what happened. When I was in the military, I can remember sergeants coming out with, you might see a man and a woman, or a man come out with them, and there'd be a formation that said, Private so-and-so, step forward. Okay, you're going with this guy, you're getting married, you got to set up an allotment. And it was as simple as that. You're going to go get married now. You got a girl pregnant. And that's, it didn't have, so those kind of mistakes would happen. And abortion came out because a lot of it was done. You always hear this term, hanger abortion. Those were rare. A lot of doctors performed these, but it was illegal. And I remember thinking, is it for it or against it? I just kept changing because of different things I watched. I remember they had a show on back then. It was early TV. It was like, I think it was called The Advocates. That could be wrong, but they used to set it up like a courtroom. And I remember Senator Sam Erwin, who was in the Watergate hearings, was there. What you did is you had one side, they had witnesses, and they called them. They got up, they were questioned by both sides, just like in a court. And then the other side would have witnesses, and they'd be questioned. Really, really great educational TV for the masses. I mean, that was back when they had a lot of good shows like that on. And I remember there was one about abortion, on whether it had to legalize it. And there was this argument. And at that time, I was kind of leaning, for it. This is probably a good thing. But there was this woman, and it was a new agency that had started up called Planned Parenthood, a newer one. You've heard about it now. Yeah. But Planned Parenthood is not what it used to be. It used to be that it was for planning a family, and they would show you the best birth control methods, the best, and how to help you decide financially and other ways. It was just a really good agency to try to plan your family, because they knew people needed to try to plan it instead of just have them. Well, there was the woman who was in charge of Planned Parenthood was one of the witnesses. And they asked her about it because they thought she'd be for it as another tool for Planned Parenthood. And she said, no, I'm against it. And I said, how could you be against it? And that's what everybody thought. They said, well, explain it. She says, what I'm afraid of is if you make this legal, this will not become one of the big ways people use for contraception. And she says to me, that's horrible. And I could predict there'll be millions of them if you do this. She was right. Historically, she could see ahead, and that's what happened. She predicted it. And I was still wavering then, even though I heard her, that really was stunning. It wasn't until started seeing what was happening. I thought, my God, they're using this. People are using this for the wrong reason. Anyway, still always, the whole country vacillates about that. But the country changed because of that. And the country will never really quite, I'm not sure if we'll ever get back to being safe. The Supreme Court made a decision back then about it, and it was an activist decision. If anybody thinks that the early founders of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, having foreseen this, would have said, yeah, we're for that, that's a lie. And everybody knows it. Anybody that's done any kind of work in law history knows that is not whatever, that intent for privacy was never meant that. So it was an activist position. It's like, well, let's just make it legal. And we'll say it's privacy so nobody can say, well, it was the same thing, different. But during the Civil War, before the Civil War started, there was a case made by the Supreme Court. It's the same thing. They were talking about the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, saying that all men are created equal. And it was a big part of it. Jefferson wrote those words. Jefferson knew how important they were, yet he still had slaves. But he always thought that, well, someday we won't need them. But all men are created equal. They didn't say all white men, or all this kind of man, or all just property owners. No, all men are created equal. And it was considered a divine idea that this is self-evident. All men are created equal. We're all here. We're all. Doesn't mean you'll have equal outcomes. Everything's equal for you, but you were created that way. You have those legal rights that anybody else has. So that was the idea. So this came before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in a famous ruling called the Dred Scott decision that well, those people aren't men; they're property. So that's different. They weren't including them. That's property. They come under the property laws. They don't come under the men laws. The human being laws. That's property. Well, that was a horrible decision. And that kind of just led the way for what happened next, which eventually ended up in the Civil War. Because it was just, how could you do that to the Constitution? How could you make that interpretation out of it? But the South was financially stuck with slavery. They set up a system that couldn't really survive without it back then. And all the problems that we had after that, Civil War, race relations here, until the 60s. Look at it. I've lived through just a time when there were the drinking fountains in the South, and there were the riots, and they were jailing Martin Luther King all the time. We got to see a black president. Times have changed. Anybody thinks they haven't read a history book. And it happened relatively quick. Nowhere else in history have things moved as fast as they do in the United States. They just, culturally, it moves fast. Other cultures, Japan had a fuel system for thousands of years. Europe had nobles, and they still have a king and queen over there for crying out loud. I mean, it's still, because they didn't want to give it up. They romanticized it so much, but Europe was set up that way for a long time, and it was the things America was kind of created fast, and it's had to move fast. And we've had a big draw with a lot of immigration, so new things are kind of common, and cultural changes. There's always a conflict with it, but it always comes about. We don't kill each other here. Whereas in Europe, they just killed each other. I don't like your culture, so I'm going to destroy it. It was just, Europe's got a, you wonder how those people ever even survived. As a matter of fact, I don't think they would have survived to this date if it hadn't been for the United States. So the United States did something that no other country's done, no other culture's done.
Mm-hmm.
We developed, in the past, all through history, when you develop a superior army, or a superior navy, or a superior battle tactic, countries have used it as far as it would go.
Mm-hmm.
Give you an example. Alexander the Great had a way of fighting which the hoplite type of armies they had in Greece and Rome forever, but his father came up with a different way where they used long spears, middle range spears, and short spears. And they all got behind shields, so you had people 3 rows back with spears,
Mm-hmm.
and then people 2 rows, and then the guy right up front with another row. And they all went different directions. And nobody learned how to defeat that particular setup.
Mm-hmm.
And he took that army all the way to India, and conquered all that property because of a battle tactic.
Mm-hmm.
And they couldn't figure out how to flank it.
Yeah.
Once you got to the flank of it, then they were trapped because you can't turn those spears. They have to go up. That's the only way you can turn, and so it was a bit of a problem. And and then you had the British Navy. Well, you had the Spanish Armada. The Spanish, they went as far as they could, but then they got sunk by the British. British beat the Spanish mostly at sea. They took on the French mostly at sea. That war kind of continued on, but the British did wind up taking their seafaring, moving their armies around all over the world, all the way to India again.
Mm-hmm.
Little island, Britain. Through the Americas. They because they had a superior navy and they knew how to use it.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, throughout history, you can find the horsemen like the Huns used,
Mm-hmm.
where they swept across northern Europe. All the way into Iran and everywhere. If you go back into that country, just about everybody's related to Genghis Khan somewhere. And they the time that changed all through history was when the United States developed a nuclear weapon. The United States developed an atom bomb through the Manhattan Project near the end of World War II, and they got into it before we even ended with Germany, because they were scared to death the Germans were going to develop this.
Mm-hmm.
And the Germans would have no compunction about using it. As a matter of fact, like I say, if the United States hadn't gotten involved in that war, Europe would have been taken. The Germans would have eventually developed that.
Mm-hmm.
And then it would have been the rest of the world. And because the Germans, like I said, they had no compunction. They would organize everything. They were going to organize Europe. They just, and it was, but the United States entered that war, and it stopped. She's waving at me. Anyway, the United States entering that war and then developing the weapon first. The soldiers, especially the Marines that fought in Okinawa in the Navy, learned just how awful going on the main line was going to be.
Mm-hmm.
They figured it would probably cost about 1 million more American lives to go through Japan.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what the Japanese wanted. So you're not going to conquer the mainland. Well, the United States answer for that was just one plane, one bomb,
Mm-hmm.
and dropped it on a city. So now we want you to negotiate.
Mm-hmm.
And do it. So one more plane, dropped it on another city. And then the emperor knew that this is crazy. And the army knew we can't even fight them.
Mm-hmm.
All we're going to do is get blowed up.
Yeah.
They don't have to send their troops here.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the reason the Japanese decided to surrender at that point. That was just a different culture. It's just the way the Japanese were.
Yeah.
don't get me wrong, the Japanese had no compunction. If you ever read another great book about Shanghai, or not Shanghai, it's when the Japanese went into China. They went into a city and they killed, it was like mostly in the hundreds of thousands. Horribly. The Rape of Nanking. Rape of Nanking is the book. And it was just a mentality that started, and it worked into a culture in the military. And it went nuts there. And even the Germans weren't sure. They wrote back saying, we may not be able to be allies with these people. This is too horrific. We're not overseeing this just... And these are the Germans. That was... No, this can't... Anyway, but it was a cultural problem. So anyway, but because they dropped that bomb, they decided, okay, we have no choice. And so they surrendered. But the United States had the ultimate weapon. Russia was still threatening us. There's nothing stopping them from dropping one on Moscow, dropping one on Stalingrad, any other cities up there. Say, no, you have to understand, we need your surrender too. And then just gone around the world like that. This is how now we're going to run things. But we didn't. First time in human history that somebody had that power and said, well, we've got it. Let's refrain from using it. And whether that was the right decision or not, I couldn't speculate. I don't know how history would have gone. But as far as humanity goes, as far as our human being, our way of becoming better as people, it was the right decision. Because it marked a milestone. That this is possible then. We don't have to do this. You know, in the United States, sure, you don't have to do this. Maybe there's not as good enough reason to do that. It's kind of like countries want to become monopolies. They want to control everything because they think they'll get richer that way. Well, they kind of know through centralized planning like we had in Germany, or like we had in, well, Germany too, but in China, and which you still have in China, and Russia, that there's a weakness to it, centralized planning. That's probably the biggest problem with socialism, is it's working from the top down. If you want to be a socialist, all you have to do is give away most of your stuff to other people and be happy about it. That's socialism. And when over 50% of the people are doing that, well, then you've kind of worked from the bottom up. Now you can have something that maybe can work. But when you try to work it from the top down, you start out where they have to have a very powerful government, and that government has to take everybody's stuff and then redistribute it, each according to their need, and then this, what was it Karl Marx said? That's another interesting book to read. You start out with Karl Marx was making plans. This is going to dovetail into something your generation's got to worry about. But Karl Marx made a plan because we had an industrial revolution. Before the industrial revolution, this predates World War II, okay? Before the industrial revolution, which started actually back during the Civil War, before the Civil War, but it was with steam power, okay? When we developed steam power, humanity, they say our technical advancement doubled in 15 years. For all of our humanity before that, the 15 years doubled. And if you think it's going slower now, you're wrong. It's computers are changing everything. Anyway, it disrupts society when something like that happens. They used to have a guild system. Okay, if you wanted to, say you wanted to be, your father was a plumber, or a tanner, or something, you would work for your dad, or you'd work for somebody else that your dad knew, and you would learn that trade. You'd be an apprentice, and then you'd work up to a journeyman, and then maybe you might open up your own shop. Maybe you're a chairmaker, okay? And they built beautiful furniture back then. But that system's expensive. So not everybody gets a good chair, okay? But it was a system. That was what was in place.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they disrupted that with the Industrial Revolution. All of a sudden, they found out they could make things better and quicker and more efficiently, cheaper, if they just put them all on an assembly line. Mm-hmm. Now, instead of this guild doing this, we'll just build a chair with these machines that are run by steam power, mm-hmm. and we'll, do all this work and put them all together. Well, that worked really good at first. A lot of people had great jobs. There's jobs everywhere. The factories ringing up everywhere. Carnegie was building steel. There was all kinds of railroads were going in. It was a heck of a time. Things were going good. And then they started, this would be the downfall of capitalism, they started changing the way they looked at how to do that, how to squeeze and get more money out of it. Mm-hmm. And people like Rockefeller, who owned gas at the time, Carnegie owned steel. Trying to wonder, Carnegie, there was Morgan, it was banking. And it was actually called Morganization, where they started squeezing. Well, pretty soon they just kept competing against each other, squeezing more and more. Well, pretty soon you had kids working in mines mm-hmm. that were, and working in factories, phenomenal shifts, more than anybody works now. And was that the intent? Is this where this is going? We're back to serfdom. And that's the mistake with monopolies, mm-hmm. with the idea of monopolies, the idea of trying to control everything. You don't want it. And that's really what America's kind of a lesson of. We still try to do it. Right now, Google's got pretty much of a monopoly. Mm-hmm. Amazon's getting a monopoly. And this is getting to be a little bit frightening because it doesn't work well. You've got a centralized planning going on in those corporations that are kind of dictating to everybody else. What Rockefeller learned is that when they broke him up, when Theodore Roosevelt, the trust buster, broke them up, he thought, well, that's the end, I've lost my fortune. No, he made more money. Mm-hmm. By breaking them up, he made more money. And this was a hard lesson to learn. How does that happen? Well, read from the younger Rockefellers, they said it was like he didn't realize that suddenly he was sitting on the board of a whole lot of companies instead of just one, and they were all competing against each other, so they're all trying to get to be more and more, they control different areas, they're all trying to get more and more successful, that it just made it even boom more. There was more innovation, more mm-hmm. because of the competition. And that's the thing about America, it's always kind of turned back that way. There's seems to be a movement going on now, this is what you have to worry about, to try to stop that. And you got to be very careful here. This is a very dangerous time because innovation and freedom are the keys to real success. And it's us, you're almost saying no to something. What's going to happen now is people are going to start losing their jobs to equipment. Mm-hmm. These machines are getting smarter and smarter and smarter. So old jobs that we used to have are going to disappear. A lot of them will stay for a while. Welding will stay for a while. They're not plumbing well because you always have to attach this stuff somewhere. You can build a pipe somewhere. We do. Mm-hmm. Somebody's still got to know how to put it together. So it's going to happen. That won't happen real fast. There's a lot of things that are happening fast. Cars running by themselves. Mm-hmm. There'll be a time where you can get onto I'm sure, that you'll get onto something like freeways, because the freeways are already there. Mm-hmm. And it's already land that's been set aside. Unless somebody can think of a better way of transporting, where you get into like an electric car mm-hmm. that you're not driving, and it just hooks in. Maybe you drive it up to the on-ramp, yeah. But then you just hook into the computer. You can't get on unless you have the chip that'll let you hook on the computer. Mm-hmm. And that's run by a master computer that's just running all the traffic. Then you can run it bumper to bumper. And you can run it fast. Yeah. And somebody, I got to get off at this exit, it just opens up the traffic and moves you off of it because it's running all those cars. Yeah. That seems really science fiction, but it's not. It's really, we're getting closer and closer. Like I said, it'll be your guys' day. Mm-hmm. they may come up with something, another way of transporting. We can move a lot of people really quick that won't call for that. But I'm not even sure how much people will have to transport, just because there won't be the work going to jobs like there used to be. Something else will have to take its place.
Mm-hmm.
And it can't be a great big government that gives us stuff. That's a nightmare.
Mm-hmm.
It really is. That takes away everything. That takes away your soul. Then the machines win. Then your AI wins.
Yeah.
It's going to do all the thinking. It's going to run everything.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to do nothing. I mean, it's humans got to have something that they're doing, something that they're striving for. So that's kind of why you're here.
Mm-hmm.
You have to have the outlets to be able to do it. And but that's not going to be, in my generation, that's not going to be a problem. That is coming for you, and it is something to be wary of. And you got to be very wary of people or ideas that try to stop any kind of the freedom that we already got. We should be able to, when the kids were rioting, Vietnam, when that was going on, people were taking over college campuses. Berkeley, it's a big one. They took it over.
Mm-hmm.
The students, they kicked out the administrators. They took over all the offices. They blocked all the exits and everything.
Mm-hmm.
And it was because they were fighting for free speech.
Yeah.
By gosh, we want free speech. We want to be against the war. We want to be able to talk about it. We want to be able to do this.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, then what? And the free speech did come about on the campuses.
Yeah.
Because it should have been.
Mm-hmm.
But Berkeley doesn't have it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And those of my generation that protested, they're in charge now. First thing they wiped out.
Mm-hmm.
No. I don't think they meant to do it. I happened to meet a professor that was from Berkeley, just retired.
Mm-hmm.
And I met him on a flight, getting ready to get a flight. I said Berkeley on. I was looking at him. He was around my age, but he went the hippie route and the school route. And I said, wow, I seem to remember when we were young, it was all about free speech. He said, oh, yeah, it's all gone now.
Mm-hmm.
It's all gone. I said, well, what do you think? He says, it's horrible. He says, you can't say anything. At least when I was working there. I mean, once that started,
Mm-hmm.
it was like the kids were even against you. They wanted, he said it was something else. He says, I lived through it. He says, it's a strange outcome. Anyway, there was the times changes and something's coming back right now. I don't think it's going to win.
Mm-hmm.
I think most people are not going to, if they have any inkling at all of what, the problem is they don't teach history enough. But being able to communicate ideas
Mm-hmm.
and discuss them, or even argue them. Arguing's good. Debating them's good.
Mm-hmm.
Is really how your mind gets to take in new stuff, and
Mm-hmm.
you get to see another side. Because there's not like a goal. The goal is for me to take as much information as I can and go somewhere with it, but not to stifle information. I'm only going to get it over here. I'm only going to get what this is being told to me, and the rest of it I'm not going to. No, I'm just rattling on. I was telling about how when we were kids,
concerned about that.
how we got how we would get married in the old days, and how you could have just a guy working and the woman taking care of the kids, and women got to indulge in childbirth and
What time do you go to work?
raising children.
4. Well,
Nowadays, it's not happening.
oh, Charlie's. She's looking for her socks.
Did you have any other specific questions?
No, that went over most of what I was looking for. So.
I hope so.
Yeah. I can't see how it couldn't be. You've got lots of information to work with.